Pedro, a young teacher struggling to survive, helps a mysterious woman carry her groceries on an ordinary day. What he doesn't know is that this simple act of kindness will place him at the center of a dangerous plot. Hours later, the police knock on his door, and Pedro discovers that his life will never be the same. What was in those bags? Who was that woman? And why is he now the main suspect in a crime he didn't commit? Pedro was the kind of guy you could meet anywhere in life. A public school teacher with more bills to pay than money in his pockets, but always willing to lend a hand, even if that meant giving up the little he had. On any given evening, while dragging his feet down the boardwalk after a day full of noisy students and erased blackboards, he saw a woman struggling with heavy bags. She looked lost, nervous, glancing over her shoulder as if expecting something bad to happen. Pedro didn't think twice. "Let me help you," he said, with that tired smile only someone who's carried the weight of the world on their shoulders knows how to give. What he didn't know was that this simple, almost automatic gesture would change his life forever. Hours later, the police were knocking on his door, accusing him of something he could hardly understand. What now? How can a good man prove his innocence when everything seems to conspire against him? Pedro never had big plans or wild dreams. He lived one day at a time, trying to balance overdue bills and take care of his sick mother, who spent her days in a rocking chair, watching time pass by the window. His life was a predictable routine, until that encounter on the boardwalk. Isabel, that was her name, seemed as ordinary as anyone else, except for that air of urgency that never left her face. As they walked to her car, Pedro tried to make conversation, but she responded with monosyllables, avoiding eye contact. How strange, he thought, but quickly dismissed the feeling. After all, who are we to judge how others act, right? When they finally placed the bags in her trunk, Isabel practically fled, not even offering a decent thank you. Pedro stood there for a few seconds, scratching his head before going on his way. But what he didn't realize was that those bags held more weight than he could ever imagine. Inside them, there was money. A lot of money. Stolen money. And hours later, when two uniformed officers knocked on his door, he understood that his simple life was about to spiral into complete chaos. Detective Ricardo entered Pedro's room with that serious look only someone about to drop a bombshell can have. "Do you know this woman?" he asked, showing a photo of Isabel. Pedro furrowed his brow, confused. "I know her. Well, I met her today. We helped her with some bags at the mall." "Why?" The detective took a deep breath, as if choosing his words carefully. "This woman is involved in a $1 million heist, Pedro. And the bags you helped carry contained part of the money." The floor seemed to disappear beneath Pedro's feet. He mumbled something about not knowing anything, but the detective didn't seem convinced. "We need you to come with us to clarify a few things." As he was taken to the station, Pedro felt a whirlwind of emotions. Anger, fear, disbelief. How could this be happening to him? He was just a teacher trying to get by. But deep down, he knew the world wasn't fair. Sometimes, good people pay for others' mistakes, and he was beginning to understand that the hard way. At the station, the interrogation was long and exhausting. Pedro repeated his story several times, but no one seemed to believe him. "Why did she choose you?" the detective asked, his tone a mix of curiosity and suspicion. Pedro didn't have an answer. He barely remembered Isabel's face, let alone understand why she would involve him in something like this. But as the clock ticked away each endless minute, something started to bother Pedro. Isabel seemed nervous, yes, but there was something more. A glint in her eyes, as if she was silently begging for help. Maybe she wasn't the villain everyone was painting her to be. Maybe there was more to the story than met the eye. When he was finally released, Pedro decided he wouldn't just sit back and wait for things to work themselves out. He needed to uncover the truth, even if it meant putting his own safety at risk. The first clue came from a cafe near the mall. Pedro remembered Isabel mentioning something about grabbing a coffee before meeting him in the parking lot. There, he found a scribbled note with an address. It was a long shot, but he had nothing left to lose. When he arrived at the location, an abandoned apartment in the suburbs, Pedro felt a chill down his spine. There were photos scattered across the table, photos of him and his mother. He realized then that Isabel had known who he was from the start. But why? And it was at that moment, as he examined the photos, that he heard footsteps behind him. Before he could turn around, a deep voice cut through the silence. "Don't move." The sound of a click echoed through the room, and everything went black. In the middle of all this chaos, it makes you think about how life sometimes puts us in unexpected situations, doesn't it? Pedro did what he thought was right, helped someone in need, and still ended up in trouble. It makes us reflect. Should we stop being good just because the world might treat us badly? Well, that answer will have to wait for another time, because there's much more to come. Pedro woke up with a bitter taste in his mouth and a throbbing pain in his head, as if someone had used his skull as a drum during a street party. He was in the hospital, hooked up to machines that blinked in a nearly hypnotic rhythm. The fluorescent light from the ceiling seemed to mock him, cold and impersonal, as he tried to piece together the puzzle that his life had become. Detective Ricardo was there, sitting by the bed, with that serious expression of someone who has something important, and probably bad, to say. "You were lucky," the detective began, but Pedro knew that luck wasn't a word that really fit his current situation. Isabel's accomplice, the one who had shown up at the apartment with a gun in hand, was in custody. But that didn't mean everything was resolved. On the contrary, now Pedro needed to understand what was really going on. Ricardo explained that Isabel wasn't a cold and calculating criminal, as everyone had initially thought. In fact, she was more of a piece in a much larger game, a puppet in the hands of someone who had no qualms about using fear and violence to get what they wanted. Isabel had been forced to participate in the heist because her family was under threat. She had no choice, or at least that's what she said. And somehow, Pedro believed her. He remembered the way she acted, that constant nervousness, as if she were fighting against something invisible. But there was more. Much more. As the detective spoke, Pedro began to understand that Isabel had chosen to help him for a specific reason. It wasn't a coincidence that their paths had crossed. She had known who he was from the start. She knew about his sick mother, his financial struggles, about the fact that he was exactly the kind of person who would do anything to help a stranger. And that's exactly what she used. Not to harm him, but to ensure that part of the stolen money would be returned in a way no one would expect. Isabel had left a bag with a considerable sum hidden at Pedro's house, without him knowing. It was as if she was betting everything on his goodness, even though it could put her in even more danger. When Pedro learned this, he felt a mix of anger and admiration. Anger for being dragged into something so big without even realizing it, and admiration for Isabel's quiet courage. She could have run off with the money, could have left everything behind, but she chose to do something different. She chose to trust a stranger, someone who represented the opposite of everything that world of crime and lies meant. And now, that decision was changing Pedro's life in ways he never imagined. With the money Isabel left, Pedro managed to pay for his mother's treatment and even cleared some of the debts that had been weighing on his shoulders for years. But as relieved as he was, he knew that it wasn't enough. Isabel was no longer alive to see the impact of her choices. She had died during the confrontation with the accomplice, a silent victim of a game she never asked to play. And that left Pedro with a strange feeling, as if he were carrying a weight that didn't belong to him. He visited Isabel's grave a few days later, bringing with him simple flowers and a sense of gratitude that he couldn't describe. He stayed there for a long time, looking at the headstone, thinking about how life can sometimes be so unfair. Isabel had done something wrong, yes, but she had also done something extraordinarily right. She showed Pedro that, even in the darkest moments, there's room for kindness, for hope, for gestures that may seem small but have the power to change lives. As he walked back home, Pedro began to reflect on everything that had happened. He had always believed that helping others was the right thing to do, but now he understood that this choice came with consequences. Sometimes those consequences are good, other times, not so much. But the important thing is that you never know where a simple gesture can take you. It might lead to an interrogation at the police station, it might take you to a hospital after a shock like no other, or it might take you to a completely unexpected place, like the heart of a story you never imagined you'd live. And as Pedro continued on his way, trying to restart his life with the weight of this experience on his shoulders, he realized that there were still many unanswered questions. Who was the man who had threatened Isabel? Why was he so determined to recover the money? And perhaps the most important question of all, was Pedro really free from this story, or was there something else lurking, waiting for the right moment to resurface? These doubts kept hammering in Pedro's head, like a distant echo that won't disappear no matter how much you try to ignore it. He knew that his life would never be the same, but he also knew that there was something bigger at play. Something that went beyond him, beyond Isabel, and even beyond the money. Something he might only discover when it was too late. Pedro tried to go on with life as if everything were normal, but that was easier said than done. Every loud sound in the street made him jump. Every knock on the door felt like a premonition of something bad. He knew he couldn't just pretend nothing had happened, because the consequences of that story were still to come. He just didn't know when or how. The money Isabel had left was safely stored, but Pedro couldn't look at it without feeling a mixture of guilt and gratitude. It was as if that money carried a part of her soul, a constant reminder that kindness could exist even in the most unexpected places. But there was something that deeply bothered him. That accomplice in custody, the man who had pointed a gun at him in the apartment, was not the real mastermind behind everything. That became clear as soon as Pedro started piecing things together. Detective Ricardo had mentioned something about a bigger fish, someone who operated in the shadows and controlled everything from afar, like an invisible ghost. And it was this idea that kept Pedro awake for a few nights. Who was this person? What did they want? And more importantly, why did Isabel seem so determined to protect them? The answer began to emerge slowly and painfully. One afternoon, while cleaning the house, Pedro found something hidden inside one of the bags Isabel had left behind. It wasn't money this time, but an old notebook, with yellowed pages full of hastily scribbled notes. There were names, dates, locations, an improvised diary that seemed to tell the story behind everything. Isabel had been planning something before she died, something big. She wrote about how she had been forced into the robbery, but also about how she decided to use that situation to get back at them. Amidst the confusing notes, there were mentions of a man named Eduardo, described as the man who doesn't forgive. He was the one behind everything, the real person responsible for the threats against Isabel and her family. Pedro felt a chill as he read those words. It seemed like Isabel had left that notebook on purpose, like a coded message for anyone brave enough to continue her fight. But did he really want to get involved? He had already faced more than anyone should in a lifetime. On the other hand, how could he simply ignore what Isabel had started? She had trusted him, bet on his goodness, and now Pedro felt he had a responsibility, even though he hadn't asked for it. Determined to learn more, Pedro began investigating on his own. He knew he couldn't trust anyone, not even Detective Ricardo. Isabel's notes mentioned a bar in downtown, a discreet place where Eduardo tends to show up. It was a fragile clue, almost ridiculous, but it was all he had. That night, wearing simple clothes and trying to go unnoticed, Pedro entered the bar for the first time. The atmosphere was dark, filled with tables occupied by people who seemed to be there for reasons very different from his. He sat in a corner, observing every face, every movement, hoping to find something, or someone, who could help him understand what was really going on. Then he saw him. A tall man, in a spotless suit, with an air of authority that seemed to dominate the room. He didn't need to shout to be noticed. Just being there made everyone know who he was. Pedro's heart raced. It was him. Eduardo. The man Isabel had mentioned in the notebook, the man who didn't forgive. He was there, right in front of Pedro's eyes, talking to others as if he owned the world. And for a brief moment, Pedro felt fear. A visceral, paralyzing fear that made him question whether he had made the right choice by entering that place. But then something happened. Something that would change everything. As Pedro watched Eduardo from a distance, he realized the man wasn't alone. There was another person beside him. Someone Pedro immediately recognized. It was Isabel's son, a boy who barely looked 10 years old. He was sitting there, quiet, eyes downcast, as if he were being held hostage. Pedro's blood boiled. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about control, revenge, cruelty. Eduardo hadn't let Isabel's family go after she participated in the robbery. He kept using them as pawns in his dirty game. That sight ignited something inside Pedro, something he didn't know existed. He couldn't just leave and pretend he hadn't seen anything. He couldn't abandon Isabel's son to a man like Eduardo. But what could he do? He was just a teacher, an ordinary man who could barely handle his own problems. How could he confront someone like Eduardo? As he walked home that night, Pedro felt a mix of anger and determination. He knew he was about to get involved in something much bigger than himself, something that could put his life at risk. But he also knew he couldn't just give up. Isabel had trusted him, and now he felt he had a mission, even if it meant sacrificing everything he had worked for up until then. In the silence of the early morning, Pedro opened Isabel's notebook again. Among the notes, there was one sentence underlined several times. Kindness always finds a way. He wasn't sure exactly what it meant, but something inside him told him it was true. Maybe kindness wouldn't solve everything. Maybe it wouldn't be enough to defeat men like Eduardo. But in the end, it was the only thing that truly mattered. It was what defined who you were, even when the world tried to turn you into something else. And with this thought, Pedro decided to move forward. He didn't know exactly what he would do next, but he knew he couldn't quit. For Isabel, for her son, for himself.